Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and in this tutorial I want to talk to you about how to adjust the depth of your yoke. Whether you're working on a top-down or a bottom-up sweater, there are some strategies you can use to adjust that upper portion of your sweater to get a good fit every time. So we're going to go through those three of those strategies in this video. But before we get to those strategies, we need to know what it is that we're adjusting and how we're adjusting it. So the first thing to think about is what kind of yokes would this particularly work for? So when I talk about a yoke in this video, I'm thinking about a specific kind of yoke. I'm thinking about a circular yoke and maybe a raglan yoke. I'm not really thinking about a yoke that is has armhole shaping of any particular kind or a set-in sleeve or anything like that. I would do different adjustments for those kinds of yokes. So think about what kind of sweater you're working on, and if you have a circular yoke or a raglan sweater, then this tutorial is going to be the best fit for you. That's the what are we adjusting. Now, how much are we adjusting it, right? So in order to know how much we need to adjust our yoke depth, we need to have some good measurements of our bodies or our favorite sweaters to work from. I prefer Maggie Righetti's strategy from Sweater Design in Plain English, and I can't quite demonstrate it on myself, and you probably can't measure it on yourself. You need to get a partner for this. But you would take a knitting needle, like a straight knitting needle or a ruler, and put it underneath your arm at that place where your body meets your arm, and you'll see that as you're looking, if somebody else is looking at you across the back, you can kind of draw an invisible line from where that ruler is sitting across your back. So if I were to imagine my mannequin as a human here, I would have her hold the ruler or the knitting needle right at that point where the body joins the underarm. I put my measuring tape at the nape of the neck, right back here, and let it hang down, and I'd want to imagine that invisible line from that underarm spot, and then I can take my measurement. So in this case, it's about 7 inches. You will want to add ease to that number for each sweater that you make, and that number can vary depending on the pattern and the designer and your own goals or expectations for the garment. So for each sweater, you want to add the amount of ease that you expect to your body measurement, and that is the final yoke depth that you're actually going for. Now you can take that number and compare it to whatever pattern you're working on to see what the designer's assumptions are. Now, for example, in this sweater, the Azami sweater, the designer's expectation is that the yoke depth would be about 8.5 inches. And as I mentioned, for me, that's a little bit long. Now here's where the adjustment part comes in. You don't necessarily want a yoke that's going to be too long, because that'll mean you'll have armpits that are kind of hanging down well below your actual armpit, right? And you don't want it too tight, because then it'll kind of sit way up and crunch in your armpit, right, if the yoke depth is too small. So you want to find that just right yoke depth, and now you know what that number is. So you can now adjust whatever's going on in this upper portion of the yoke. So let's turn to those 3 specific strategies for making adjustments to that span of fabric or the yoke of your sweater. The first strategy for adjusting your yoke depth is going to be to change your row gauge. In most typical sweaters, yokes are going to be knit vertically, either from the top down or from the bottom up, which means that we're going to need to adjust our rows or rounds per inch rather than our regular stitch gauge if we're going to change the depth of our yoke. So for example, if our pattern is being worked at a gauge of 6 rows per inch, and we think that our yoke is going to end up being too deep for us, given the number of rows that we're expected to work, we could adjust our gauge so that we're getting 7 or 8 rows per inch, meaning that we're going to compact the amount of rows in the space that's available to us. If, on the other hand, our pattern is calling for a row gauge of 8 rows per inch, and we feel like our yoke is going to be too short, we could adjust our needles and our gauge so that we're knitting something more like 7 or 6 rows per inch. That will expand the amount of space that it will take to complete all of the rows that are called for in the pattern. And that way, by changing your row gauge, you're able to expand and contract the amount of fabric that's going to be produced over the depth of the yoke. The second strategy for adjusting the yoke depth is to add or delete rows or rounds from the yoke. So for example, in that Azami sweater I was just showing you on the mannequin, if you look at the pattern, you would note the designer's expectations are that the lace and smocking motif goes all the way down to where the sleeve separation is going to happen. My concern with this sweater is that the yoke is too deep. And instead of cutting off portion of the motif, that beautiful lace and smocking, which doesn't seem like a good spot to shorten the yoke, I decided to go up here where there's more plain stitches and some basic ribbing to take away some rows or rounds. So in this case, to adjust my yoke depth and maintain all the patterning, I simply moved everything up by a few rows by deleting some of the rows at the upper portion of the sweater where there was some plain knitting. If, on the other hand, you felt like your yoke was going to be too shallow, you can always add rows or rounds to the upper portion of your yoke. Again, you'd want to use a similar principle of looking to see where the patterning is and where the shaping rows are in the yoke. And you can usually add plain amounts of knitting here, or you can add some plain rows here. And in either place, as long as you're not interfering with the motif of the sweater, you can adjust for a too shallow yoke by adding rows or rounds to the pattern. The third strategy for adjusting your yoke depth is to extract or expand on the yoke motif. So let's look at an example or two. I have a chart for a colorwork pattern here, and given my gauge swatch, I know that I'm not going to be able to fit all of these rows into my yoke without it being really, really deep. So what I chose to do with this particular pattern is extract portion of the motif. So I'm going to choose to knit this portion of the motif, which takes advantage of that central kind of character and a little bit of the Fair Isle or colorwork knitting on either side of it. Now you'll notice that this whole motif is very asymmetrical. It's not, which is not very typical for a lot of colorwork sweaters. So you could rearrange these different bits and pieces, or you could extract a different portion of the motif and say you're just going to work on this portion. For me, I liked the center symbol in there and I wanted to keep it, so that's why I extracted this portion. But that is a way for me to work and kind of keep the character of the motif while also achieving the yoke depth, which is shorter, that I need for this particular sweater. So that is the extraction portion of this adjustment idea. Let's talk about the expansion portion. We could look at this in reverse. So let's say this is what we were given in the pattern, and given our gauge, it was actually just going to be this very small portion of the sweater, and we wanted to make it last farther and make the yoke a little bit deeper, right? Because it's going to be too shallow if we only work this much. Well, we could do just the opposite of what we did before, and we could reimagine the motif by adding some of the rows and different figures in it to the bottom or to the top to make that motif longer, to allow us to have a deeper yoke. So that explains how we could expand our yoke motif. So just to recap our three strategies, if you want to change the depth of your yoke, you could change your row gauge. Remember, we're thinking vertically here, and if you need to make it shallower or deeper, you can do so by adding more or fewer stitches to the fabric that's happening in your yoke. You can add or delete rows or rounds from the pattern. Now those ideally will come from places in the yoke where there's nothing else that's super complicated going on. So maybe it's right up around the neckline, maybe it's right down before the sleeve separation, maybe it's somewhere in the middle of the pattern where there are some plain rows. You can always delete rows or rounds to make your yoke shallower or deeper. And finally, you can extract or expand on the yoke motif. So if you have colorwork, lace, or cables, you could take a section of that so that it makes your yoke shallower, or you could expand on that to make your yoke deeper. Those are just three possible strategies for adjusting your yoke depth. I'm sure there are many others, and I'd love to hear about them in the comments. So I hope this tutorial on adjusting the depth of your yoke has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below here, or you can always email me at knittingthestash@gmail.com. I'll see you in the next tutorial. Take care.